haunting voice. In a cramped London room, a candle burns low, its trembling flame the only light in the fog-filled night. A man sits alone, his fingers stained with ink, his breath shallow with exhaustion. On his desk lies a single sheet of paper, words that will one day set the world on fire. Outside, carriages rattle down the cobblestone streets. Inside, revolution is being written. This man owns nothing. No fortune, no country, not even peace. Yet within him lives an idea so powerful, so dangerous, that kings will fear it, priests will curse it, and millions will die in its shadow. His name, Karl Marx. He does not wield a sword or command armies. His weapon is thought. His battleground, the human mind. What began as the dream of equality will become the century's greatest storm. From royal palaces to factory floors, from Europe's dusty streets to the farthest corners of the earth, his words will echo through history, and the world will never be the same again. London, 1850. The night is silent except for the scratching of a pen. Inside a small, dimly lit room on Dean Street, a man sits hunched over a wooden desk. The air is thick with smoke from a dying candle, and the cold of the London fog seeps through the cracks in the walls. His wife sleeps in the next room, exhausted, hungry, their last coin spent on bread for their children. But he cannot stop. Not now. Every word he writes feels like fire on paper, a rebellion born from ink and rage. He pauses for a moment, whispering to himself, "Workers of the world, unite." That man was Karl Marx, and what he was writing that night would ignite revolutions, shake empires, and divide humanity for the next 2 centuries. The hidden beginning. Karl Heinrich Marx was born on May 5, 1818, in the small Prussian town of Trier, near the river Moselle. His family was of Jewish descent, but his father, Heinrich Marx, converted to Lutheranism, not out of faith but necessity. In Prussia, Jews were banned from holding certain professions. So Heinrich changed his religion to protect his family's future. From a young age, Karl learned that power and freedom were never equal. He watched how laws bent for some and broke others. He saw injustice not as an accident, but as a system. As a boy, he devoured books on philosophy and poetry. At the University of Bonn, he drank, dueled, and wrote radical essays that alarmed professors. By the time he moved to Berlin, his focus turned from literature to something more dangerous: revolutionary philosophy. Berlin in the 1830s was a city under surveillance. The king's secret police hunted anyone who questioned authority. But Marx didn't just question authority, he questioned reality itself. A mind on fire. Influenced by the works of Hegel, Marx began to believe that history wasn't random, that it followed patterns of conflict and change. For him, every empire, every civilization, every economic system was built on one thing: the struggle between those who have and those who have not. It was an idea both terrifying and beautiful, that the poor, if united, could overthrow the rich and reshape the world. But ideas like that had a price. Soon, Marx found himself on the watch list of every European government. He was expelled from Germany, exiled from France, and finally found refuge in Belgium, where he met the man who would become his closest ally: Friedrich Engels, the brother in revolution. Engels was the son of a wealthy textile manufacturer. Yet he despised the world his father built. While working in England, Engels saw children laboring in factories, their hands raw from spinning cotton for pennies a day. He documented everything, the smoke, the filth, the despair, in a book called The Condition of the Working Class in England. When Marx read it, he said, "This is not just a book. It's the scream of an entire generation." Together they became a force unlike any other. Marx, the philosopher, Engels, the realist. One provided theory, the other resources. And together they began to plan something audacious. A manifesto that would expose the hidden machinery of society. A world ready to burn. By 1848, Europe was on the brink. Factories filled the cities, yet poverty spread faster than progress. Workers labored 16 hours a day while the elite lived in palaces of marble and glass. In Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, whispers of revolt filled the streets. It was in that moment of chaos that Marx and Engels released their most dangerous weapon, the Communist Manifesto. It began with words that thundered through time. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. The document was short, barely 12,000 words, but its impact was seismic. It declared that human history was nothing more than the story of class struggle, that the working class or proletariat would one day rise to overthrow the bourgeoisie and build a world where everyone shared equally in the fruits of labor. To some, it sounded like justice. To others, a nightmare. The man behind the myth. But behind the firebrand philosopher was a man living in darkness. Despite his brilliance, Marx was constantly broke. His wife Jenny pawned her family heirlooms just to feed the children. One of their daughters died from malnutrition, another from tuberculosis. Marx himself was plagued by illness, boils, liver disease, and depression. He joked that, if my body were as strong as my will, I'd have conquered Europe. He had no money, no nation, and no peace. But he had an idea that refused to die. The final image. Picture this. A man with uncombed hair, his clothes worn thin, sitting in the silent reading room of the British Museum. Stacks of books tower around him, on economics, history, and science. He spends 12 hours a day there taking notes, connecting the dots between poverty, profit, and power. It was here that Marx would begin writing the book that would define his legacy, Das Kapital, a work that would take him 20 years to complete, and would change how the world understood wealth forever. Narrator softly. They called him mad. They called him dangerous. But perhaps the world fears most the man who can see its reflection too clearly. Karl Marx was no king, no soldier, no priest, and yet his words would shake thrones, silence prophets, and awaken the masses. This was only the beginning. The year was 1848, the year Europe caught fire. From the cobblestones of Paris to the alleys of Berlin, the air trembled with rebellion. Workers marched. Banners rose. The sound of drums and gunfire blended into one furious heartbeat. It was the springtime of nations. A wave of uprisings demanding freedom, bread, and dignity. The old empires, built on monarchy and wealth, stood trembling before the anger of their own people. And at the heart of this storm stood Karl Marx, a world on the edge. In a small apartment in Brussels, Marx and his friend Friedrich Engels worked tirelessly by candlelight. They had watched the revolution spread. France overthrowing its king, Germany roaring for unity, and Italy dreaming of freedom. But Marx saw something deeper. He realized that politics alone could not change the world, that beneath every throne and flag lay the same invisible chain, the struggle between those who own and those who labor. That winter, Marx and Engels completed their most daring work, the Communist Manifesto. The manifesto is born. The pamphlet was small, a few dozen pages printed on cheap paper, but its message was thunder. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. It was more than philosophy. It was a call to arms. Marx demanded that the workers of every nation rise together to break the walls that divided them. He wrote, "The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win." The word spread like wildfire through Europe's underground presses. Printers worked in secret. Students whispered the lines in candlelit gatherings, and the powerful began to tremble. The world responds. Governments reacted with panic. In Prussia, Austria, and France, the secret police raided homes, arrested activists, and burned Marx's pamphlets wherever they found them. In Cologne, Marx founded a newspaper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. But soon even that voice of defiance was silenced. By May 1849 his printing press was seized, his writings banned, and a warrant issued for his arrest. Marx fled, first to Paris, then to London. A refugee hunted across borders for nothing more than his ideas. Exile and poverty. London became his final exile, and his greatest test. There, Marx and Jenny lived in near starvation on Dean Street in Soho. They pawned furniture, clothes, even Jenny's wedding ring. Their children often went without food. The winter frost crept through the walls like a curse. But Marx refused to surrender. By day, he haunted the British Museum's reading room, poring over economic data, records of trade, labor, and industry. By night he wrote angry, brilliant words that would become the foundation of modern socialism, the ghost of the revolution. Meanwhile, Europe returned to silence. The revolutions had failed. The kings were back on their thrones, and the workers returned to the factories in despair. But Marx saw something others didn't. He believed that revolutions never truly die. They wait. They sleep beneath the surface, growing stronger with every injustice, until one day they rise again. He wrote to Engels, "We have not been defeated, only delayed. The specter of revolution still walks among us." Seeds of the future. Marx was now seen as both prophet and outlaw. To the poor he was a voice of hope. To the rich, a dangerous dreamer. But history was already shifting beneath their feet. Factories were multiplying. Cities were swelling. Children worked 12 hours a day for a handful of coins. The gap between wealth and hunger grew wider. And the very world Marx had described was coming alive before everyone's eyes. He once told Jenny, "They think I write about the future, but I am only describing their present." Soft violin music fades in, melancholy yet powerful. Narrator low tone. He was an exile without a nation, a thinker without a home, and yet his ideas had already crossed every border in Europe. Karl Marx had written his revolution into existence. And though the flames of 1848 had dimmed, beneath the ashes something was still burning, something that would, in time, consume the world. The revolutions had fallen silent. The king still ruled, the rich still dined, and the poor, they went back to the machines, to the smoke, to the endless clatter of factories that devoured their youth. But in a narrow street in Soho, London, in a dark, airless room above a small shop, a man sat writing, a man who refused to give up the dream. His name was Karl Marx, and though the world had forgotten him, he had not forgotten the world. A life in exile. Marx was now a ghost among men, a political exile, a stranger in every nation. London was his last refuge, but it was also his prison. He had no income, no stable work. His wife, Jenny, sold her dresses to pay the rent. Sometimes they survived on nothing but bread and tea. Their 3 children, Guido, Francisca, and Edgar, died one by one, victims of cold, hunger, and sickness. Their deaths broke Marx in ways he could never write about. He told Engels once, "The philosophers explain the world in many ways. I wish one could change it." And still, every morning, he walked to the British Museum reading room, his shoes worn thin, his pockets empty, but his mind burning brighter than ever. The Library of Revolution. Inside that great dome of silence, among shelves heavy with the dust of centuries, Marx found his new battlefield, the study of capitalism itself. He read everything: trade reports, factory records, scientific journals, even the ledgers of companies that never knew his name. He filled notebook after notebook, trying to map the invisible threads that bound the world. How labor became profit, and how profit turned men into slaves of their own making. He was not seeking revenge anymore. He was seeking understanding. In those years of isolation, he began the work that would become his life's masterpiece, Das Kapital. The creation of Das Kapital. The book was more than an economic treatise. It was a mirror held up to civilization. Marx argued that capitalism, while powerful, was built on an endless cycle of exploitation. Workers sold their labor to survive. Yet the wealth they created never belonged to them. It accumulated upward, into fewer and fewer hands, until society itself began to fracture. To Marx, capitalism was not just an economy. It was a living organism, feeding on human labor, growing vast, until one day it would collapse under its own weight. He wrote tirelessly for years, driven by both obsession and pain. Sometimes he coughed blood onto the very pages he wrote. Sometimes he went days without eating. But he continued, because, as he said, ideas are bullets and I must keep loading the gun. Engels, the guardian of the flame. Through all those dark years, one man stood by him, Friedrich Engels. While Marx lived in poverty, Engels managed his family's factory in Manchester, sending money to Marx in secret envelopes. It was Engels who paid for the food, the rent, and even the printing of Das Kapital. Their bond was more than friendship. It was faith. Engels believed that one day, Marx's words would awaken the world. When Marx fell ill, Engels would visit London bringing food and medicine. He would often find Jenny crying beside her husband's desk, while Marx, pale and coughing, still scribbled notes through the night. Engels once wrote, Marx is the most hated and the most loved man I know, and both are for the same reason. He makes people see the truth. A world in transition. As Marx wrote, the world was changing around him. The Industrial Revolution had turned cities into monsters of smoke and steel. Railroads stretched like veins across the earth, carrying coal, iron, and human ambition. But beneath that progress, a silent misery grew. Child labor, disease, wages that barely kept families alive. The rich grew richer. The poor sank deeper into despair. Marx saw in these streets the very prophecy he had written. The struggle between capital and labor. The birth of a new global order. He began to write faster, his pen racing against time. He feared he would die before finishing his work. The book that changed everything. Finally, in 1867, after nearly 2 decades of labor, the first volume of Das Kapital was published in Hamburg, Germany. The book was dense, complex, filled with analysis that few could grasp completely. Yet for those who did, it was like unlocking a forbidden truth. The elite dismissed it as madness. The poor whispered its name in secret meetings. And slowly across Europe, its words began to spread. From factory to factory, from worker to worker. Like sparks before a storm. Marx had given the world a new lens through which to see itself. He had turned economics into destiny, recognition and reflection. But fame brought no peace. By the late 1860s, Marx's health was failing. He could barely walk without pain. Jenny was constantly ill. And one by one, his remaining children left home, seeking a life beyond the walls of poverty. Sometimes, visitors would find him asleep at his desk, his head resting on Das Kapital. The candle burned down to nothing. He was no longer the firebrand of 1848, but an old lion worn and scarred, still roaring into the void. He once told a friend, "I'm not sure if I have changed the world, but the world has surely changed me." The birth of a movement. In 1864, Marx helped establish the International Workingmen's Association, known as the First International, a global alliance of workers and thinkers united by one dream, a fair and equal world. From London to New York, his ideas began to take root. Unions formed. Strikes erupted. Workers demanded rights, education, and dignity. And though the First International would later collapse, the spirit lived on. In the minds of those who believed that justice could not remain a dream forever. End of Act 3. Soft orchestral swell, mixture of hope and melancholy. Narrator, reflective tone. Karl Marx did not live to see his revolution. He did not see the nations that would rise in his name, nor the blood that would be spilled in pursuit of his dream. But he had done something no king, no general, no emperor ever could. He had changed how humanity thought about itself. He had written the anatomy of power. He had given voice to the voiceless. And though his body was breaking, his idea had just begun to live. Pause, soft breath. In the silence of the British Museum, beneath the echo of turning pages, a storm was gathering. A storm that would soon sweep across the world. March 14, 1883. In a quiet study in London, the world lost a man whose ideas were still waiting to be born. Karl Marx sat in his chair by the window, surrounded by papers and books, his lifelong companions. When his housekeeper entered, he looked as if he had simply fallen asleep. But his pen had stopped moving forever. There was no great ceremony, no royal farewell. Only 11 people attended his funeral at Highgate Cemetery. Among them was his closest friend, Friedrich Engels. Engels stood before the simple grave and said, "His name will live on through the centuries, and so will his work." Few believed it then. But within decades those words would prove prophetic. An idea becomes a force. After Marx's death, the world began to change, violently, rapidly, and irreversibly. His ideas, buried for years in academic texts and underground pamphlets, began to ignite across continents. Industrialization had turned empires into machines of profit, but also of suffering. Cities swelled with factory workers who toiled for pennies, while the rich built palaces of marble and glass. It was in this growing shadow of inequality that Marx's ideas found their voice. Workers of the world, unite. His famous call became not just a slogan but a prophecy. In Europe, new parties rose, calling themselves socialists, communists, labor movements. They carried banners painted red, the color of blood, of sacrifice, of revolution. And from the ashes of one man's poverty, a global movement began to stir. The revolution that changed the century. Then, in 1917, more than 30 years after Marx's death, his words took form, in fire and blood. Russia, exhausted by war and famine, became the birthplace of a new kind of revolution. Led by Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks rose against the crumbling Romanov dynasty. The Tsar was overthrown, the royal family executed, and in their place a new order declared itself, the world's first socialist state. Lenin called Marx his spiritual father. His speeches echoed Marx's writings word for word. A world where workers ruled, where property belonged to the people, and where history itself could be rewritten. But the dream soon grew darker. To build his utopia, Lenin unleashed terror upon those who disagreed. The revolution once meant to free men began to consume them. And when Joseph Stalin took power after Lenin's death, Marx's vision twisted into something monstrous. The shadow of Marx. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union became a machine of control. Millions were imprisoned, starved, or executed, all in the name of equality. Factories grew, cities expanded, but so did fear. Marx's idea had been turned into an empire built on silence. Yet even as it corrupted his words, the power of his ideas could not be extinguished. Across the world, from China to Cuba, from Eastern Europe to South America, people read Das Kapital and believed they had found the key to liberation. The fire spreads east. In China, a young librarian named Mao Zedong discovered Marx's writings. In the aftermath of imperial collapse, he saw in them a blueprint for rebellion, a way to free the peasants from centuries of oppression. Decades later, his revolution succeeded. In 1949, the People's Republic of China was born. But again the cost was staggering. Millions perished in the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, and the same ideals of equality became tools of control, propaganda, and fear. Still, the seed of Marx's thought had taken root deeper than ever before. By mid-century, 1/3 of humanity lived under governments that claimed his name. a divided world. The 20th century became the stage for a new kind of war, not fought with swords or muskets, but with ideologies, capitalism and communism. Two worlds, two visions of humanity's future. The Cold War began. America stood for the market, the Soviet Union for the collective. Each claimed to be the true voice of freedom. Each feared the other's existence. And in the middle of it all, the ghost of Karl Marx hovered, his name invoked by millions, his words twisted by politics, his image turned into a symbol both of hope and terror. Nations built missiles, armies stood on alert, and the fate of the world hung in a fragile balance. All in the shadow of a man who once wrote by candlelight in poverty. The collapse and the reflection. Then in 1989 the unthinkable happened. The Berlin Wall, the great symbol of division, fell. Crowds of East and West Germans embraced in the streets. Tears, laughter, disbelief. A world was being reborn. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself, the empire born from Marx's dream, collapsed. For many it was the end of an era. For others, it was the proof that Marx's ideas had failed. But the truth was more complex. Marx never saw the future that claimed his name. He never built an empire, never ordered a war, never held office. He was a philosopher, not a ruler. And though his theories were used to justify both progress and tragedy, their core question remained hauntingly relevant. Why do some have everything while others have nothing? The eternal question. Today, more than a century after his death, Karl Marx's ideas continue to echo in the world's debates about wealth, inequality, justice, and power. Every protest for fair wages, every discussion on class and privilege, every movement that questions who controls the future, carries a trace of his legacy. Some see him as a visionary who fought for the poor. Others as the thinker whose ideas fueled tyranny. But no one can deny his impact. He did not just write about history. He changed its course. Closing narration Act 4. Music swells, slow, solemn, but filled with light. Narrator calm, reverent tone. Karl Marx died with nothing. No wealth, no nation, no power. Yet his words traveled farther than any empire ever did. They inspired revolutions, toppled kings, and divided the planet. But more than anything, they forced humanity to confront the mirror of its own conscience. Perhaps that is his greatest legacy. Not in politics, not in governments, but in the eternal question that lives within every age. What does it mean to be equal? Pause. And somewhere beneath the gray London sky, the candle that burned beside him that final night still flickers in the hearts of those who dare to imagine a different kind of world. More than a century after Karl Marx's death, the world has transformed beyond imagination. Empires have fallen, new nations have risen, and technology has rewired human life. We live in a time of satellites, smartphones, and digital dreams. But if Marx could see us now, he might still recognize the old struggle, the same invisible war between wealth and labor, only now hidden behind screens and algorithms. A new kind of empire. Today the kings wear suits and logos. Their thrones are glass towers, their power measured not in land, but in data. Corporations span continents. They control what we see, buy, and even believe. Billionaires rise faster than nations, while the workers who build their fortunes remain unseen, delivering food, coding software, driving cars that belong to someone else's dream. Marx once wrote that capitalism would evolve until everything, labor, time, emotion, became a commodity. And in the 21st century, his prediction feels eerily true. We trade not only our hours, but our attention, our privacy, our very identities. The factory has become the internet. The product, us, the digital proletariat. Sound of clicking keyboards, phones buzzing. In the digital world, we are the new workers, the digital proletariat. We post, scroll, create content, feeding platforms that profit from every second of our engagement. The more we click, the richer they become. But we are paid in dopamine, not dollars. Marx warned that capitalism would find new ways to extract value, even from the most ordinary acts of life. And now, every like, every view, every purchase adds to the invisible economy of data, an empire that no one sees, but everyone serves. It is a quiet revolution, one without banners or marches, but its reach is infinite. Globalization, the world he predicted. Marx also foresaw something else. A world united by trade, technology, and markets. A global capitalism. He wrote, "The need of a constantly expanding market chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. Today that prophecy has come true. Factories in Bangladesh produce clothes for brands in Paris. Silicon chips from Taiwan power phones in New York. Children in Congo mine cobalt for electric cars in Germany. Every product tells a story of unseen hands, of distant laborers connected by an invisible chain of profit. And though the borders have faded, the inequalities remain, sharper, deeper, etched into the very design of the world economy. The modern struggle. In cities from Sao Paulo to Karachi, from London to Beijing, workers march again, not for thrones or flags, but for fair wages, dignity, and life. The protests echo with familiar cries: justice, equality, rights. They may not call themselves Marxists, but they fight for the same dream. A world where labor is valued more than wealth. When global corporations cut costs. When automation replaces people. When wages stagnate while profits soar. The old question rises again. Who truly owns the fruits of human labor? The paradox of prosperity. We live in the most prosperous age in history. Yet billions still struggle to survive. The world produces enough for everyone, but distributes it among the few. Marx called this the contradiction of capitalism. Its brilliance and its flaw. It creates abundance, yet deepens inequality. Look around. One man builds rockets to Mars, while another sleeps on the same city streets. Stock markets rise even as workers lose their jobs. Fortunes grow in silence, while hunger grows louder. These are not new patterns. They are the ghosts of Marx's pages, whispering that the story he began is not yet finished. Revisiting Marx without worship. Music softens, thoughtful piano chords. To understand Marx today is not to worship him, but to listen. He was not a prophet. He did not imagine smartphones or the metaverse, but he saw the heart of human systems, the way power gathers, the way greed justifies itself, and the way ordinary people carry the weight of it all. Modern economists still argue over him. Some say he was wrong, that capitalism, though flawed, brought innovation and progress. Others say he was simply ahead of his time, that his warnings are unfolding before our eyes. Either way, the debate itself is proof of his immortality, the return of the idea. In times of crisis, financial crashes, pandemics, recessions, his name always resurfaces. In 2008, when global markets collapsed, sales of Das Kapital spiked worldwide. In 2020, as millions lost jobs during lockdowns, social inequality became headline news again. Students, thinkers, and activists once more turned to Marx, not for revolution, but for answers. Because the ghost of Marx does not demand violence. It demands reflection. It asks the same question he once posed in a London library. Who benefits? A candle that never dies. Sound, gentle wind, pages turning, candle flickers. Somewhere in the British Museum reading room, beneath its great dome of silence, the desk where Marx once wrote still stands. Tourists pass by unaware. But for those who pause, there is a strange, quiet power in that space. The candle that once burned beside him is long gone, yet its light still lingers. In every movement that questions injustice, in every voice that refuses silence, in every heart that believes that humanity can be better than profit. Closing narration Act 5. Music swells, deep, emotional strings blending with piano. Narrator calm, resonant. Karl Marx never imagined the digital age, but his ghost walks among us. In every factory replaced by automation, in every worker replaced by code, in every debate about fairness in a world built on numbers. He was not a saint, nor a monster. He was a man, haunted by the belief that the world could be just, if only we dared to see it clearly. And maybe that belief itself is the most revolutionary thing of all. Pause, candle flame flickers out. Every great dream has a price. And Karl Marx's dream of a world without masters or slaves would demand more than anyone could imagine. He had dreamed of equality, but in the hands of rulers and revolutions, his vision became a weapon. The 20th century began with hope, but it would soon drown in fear. The revolution that ate its children. In 1917, Russia rose from the ashes of the Tsarist Empire. Vladimir Lenin promised a world for the workers, a nation built not on wealth but on justice. Factories were seized. Land was divided. The red flag rose above the Kremlin. To many it felt like prophecy fulfilled, the dawn Marx had written about 70 years earlier. But revolutions do not end when power changes hands. They begin there. As the Bolsheviks solidified control, they declared war, not just on enemies abroad, but on enemies within. Dissent was treason. Doubt was crime. And soon the dream of freedom was guarded by firing squads. The iron hand of Stalin. After Lenin's death in 1924, his successor Joseph Stalin rose to power, a man who saw the revolution as something to be controlled, not questioned. He claimed to carry Marx's banner, but where Marx had used a pen, Stalin used fear. The collectivization of agriculture forced millions of peasants into state farms. Those who resisted were branded as traitors, enemies of the people. Entire villages vanished in the Holodomor, a famine that swept through Ukraine in 1932 to 33, killing millions, and still the factories grew. Steel, coal, weapons. The Soviet machine roared to life, built on the bones of its people. Marx had envisioned the liberation of the worker. Instead, the worker became a cog in an empire of terror. The Red Empire expands. Music shifts, low brass and tension rising. After World War II, as the world rebuilt itself from ruins, the Soviet Union emerged as a superpower. Under the banner of socialism, it spread its ideology across Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, each falling under Moscow's shadow. These nations called themselves People's Republics, but their people were anything but free. Walls were built, literal and invisible, to keep citizens from leaving the paradise they were promised. The most famous of all stood in Berlin, dividing families, lives, and dreams. It became the symbol of a divided planet, one half built on profit, the other on control, and in both, humanity was lost somewhere in between. The voices of dissent. But even under oppression, truth has a way of surviving. Writers, poets, and thinkers across the Eastern Bloc began to speak, quietly, carefully, courageously. In Czechoslovakia, playwright Václav Havel wrote about the absurdity of life under tyranny. In Poland, a shipyard worker named Lech Walesa led strikes that would ignite a movement called Solidarity. And in Hungary and East Germany, students whispered words that could get them imprisoned. Freedom, democracy, hope. Marx's ideas had been meant to empower them, yet they now fought to escape the world built in his name. The Chinese chapter. Shift to subtle Chinese instruments blending with somber tones. Across the world in China, another revolution rose under Mao Zedong. In 1949, Mao declared victory. The People's Republic was born. He too carried Marx's portrait, but like others before him, he reinterpreted Marx's dream to fit his will. In The Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1962, he tried to industrialize the nation overnight. The result? Famine, chaos, and nearly 30 million deaths. Then came the Cultural Revolution, a decade of fear and madness, as young Red Guards destroyed history, religion, and art. In the name of purity, neighbors betrayed neighbors. Families were torn apart. And all the while, Mao proclaimed it was for the people. Marx's dream had once again turned on itself, a utopia built on ruins. The Cold War, the dream versus reality. While socialist nations preached equality, their citizens stood in bread lines. While capitalist nations boasted freedom, their wealth concentrated in the few. Each side pointed fingers. Each claimed moral victory, and both ignored the suffering beneath their systems. The Cold War became not just a political standoff, but an ideological one. Capitalism versus communism, freedom versus equality, America versus the Soviet Union. And caught in between were billions of ordinary people, dreamers, workers, believers, who paid the price for ideas far greater than themselves. The fall. Music slows, melancholic piano returns. By the late 1980s, the cracks began to show. The Soviet economy was failing. People were tired of waiting for the paradise they were promised. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Crowds cheered, cried, and tore it apart with their hands. It was more than stone breaking. It was history itself unraveling. In 1991, the Soviet Union, the empire that had once claimed to be the future of mankind, collapsed into dust. The red flag that had flown over the Kremlin for 7 decades was lowered for the last time, and with it fell the illusion that Marx's dream could ever be forced into existence by power. The realization. Narrator soft, emotional. It was never the idea that was cruel, it was the hands that held it. Marx's vision had been for equality, for dignity, for the end of exploitation. But when his philosophy was turned into a doctrine, when freedom was replaced by obedience, and thought by ideology, his dream became its own nightmare. The tragedy of Marxism was not in its birth, but in its corruption. The ghost in the ashes. Faint wind, turning pages, echo of footsteps in an empty hall. And yet, even after all the blood, the prisons, the fallen statues, Marx's ghost still lingers. Because beneath the wreckage, the core question remains alive. Why do so few rule so many? Every generation rediscovers it. In new forms, new struggles, new injustices. The dream refuses to die, because it was never just Marx's. It belongs to anyone who has ever looked at the world and whispered, "This isn't fair." Closing narration Act 6. Music swells, soft strings with a haunting choir. Narrator steady, somber tone. Karl Marx gave humanity a dream of equality. But when men tried to force that dream into law, it demanded obedience instead of freedom, sacrifice instead of compassion. Ideas are powerful, but power once gained forgets its purpose. And so, the dreamer's revolution became a ruler's regime, and the pen that once wrote of liberation became the shadow of the sword. Through the centuries, the fire has not gone out, only changed its form. Long pause. For in every heart that still hungers for justice, a piece of Marx's dream still burns. Quietly, dangerously, endlessly. History, they say, is written by the victors. But sometimes, it's rewritten by the forgotten. Karl Marx's world had fallen. Its empires collapsed. Its statues torn down. Its leaders exposed. And yet, in the silence that followed the Cold War, something strange began to happen. Marx's ghost, the philosopher of revolution, began to return, not as a ruler this time, but as an idea, as a question that refused to die. A world of inequality. The 21st century arrived with promises of freedom, progress, and endless growth. Technology connected billions, and the world's wealth multiplied beyond imagination. But so did inequality. By 2020, the richest 1% owned more wealth than the bottom half of humanity. Cities glowed with glass towers, while millions slept beneath them on concrete. Factories in Asia replaced those in Europe, but the rhythm was the same. The few prospering from the labor of the many. And slowly, Marx's words, written over 150 years ago, started sounding familiar again. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. The line that had once sparked revolutions now appeared in textbooks, essays, documentaries, and quiet conversations between students, activists, and thinkers. The return in academia. Sound, shuffling papers, distant university bells, a quiet classroom hum. In lecture halls from Berlin to New York, professors began dusting off old volumes of Das Kapital. Not to worship them, but to understand the patterns of modern capitalism. Economic crises in 2008 and 2020 reminded the world that the system was not unbreakable. Banks collapsed, governments panicked, and millions lost everything overnight. People asked, how can a system so rich produce so much suffering? The answers led back to Marx. His analysis of exploitation, alienation, and profit suddenly felt prophetic. To young minds disillusioned by empty politics, Marx became less of a revolutionary and more of a mirror, reflecting a truth no one wanted to face: the digital factory. Music fades into a cold, synthetic tone, like a machine heartbeat. Marx had written about factories, about workers chained to machines. But today, the factory has no walls. It's the algorithm, the gig economy, the endless scroll. Instead of steel mills, we have data centers. Instead of foremen, we have apps and platforms, tracking, timing, rewarding, and punishing. With perfect efficiency, people sell their labor not only through their hands, but through their clicks, their images, their time. The working class no longer wears uniforms. It wears exhaustion. And the capitalists of this new age aren't kings or landlords. They are corporations, invisible and omnipresent, owning not land, but information. In this sense, Marx's warning about the concentration of power has never been more real. The green struggle, transition, sound of wind through trees, faint protest chants. As the world faced climate collapse, a new kind of revolution began to rise, not against kings or employers, but against the very structure of consumption itself. Environmental activists noticed something Marx had written long ago, that capitalism treats nature like a resource to be drained, and the earth like a mine that never ends. His phrase metabolic rift, once obscure, now appeared in ecological manifestos. The planet, they said, was the new worker, exploited, overworked, and silenced. Protesters from London to Jakarta held signs quoting him. You cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. They didn't call themselves Marxists, but the soul of the idea, the critique of greed, the plea for balance, was pure Marx. The new generations. Music warms, hopeful, melancholic piano. In the late-night dorms and cafes of a restless world, a new generation began to rediscover what Marx had truly meant. Not dictatorship, not control, but justice. In podcasts, films, and social media debates, his ideas found new life, translated into the language of modern activism. Workers' rights, fair wages, feminism, racial justice, environmental reform. The slogan, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, became a moral challenge, not a political demand. For the first time in a century, people weren't afraid to ask, what if Marx was right about the sickness, but wrong about the cure? The legacy of misuse. Dark tone returns, a low hum like an old tape rewinding. But even as the world re-examined his ideas, the ghosts of his misuse still lingered. In Eastern Europe, survivors of communist regimes remembered the hunger, the fear, the silence. In China, the party still used Marx's image to justify control, a contradiction that would have horrified him. So every discussion of Marx came with a shadow, a reminder that good ideas can become dangerous when forced upon people instead of chosen by them. The Thinker and the Prophet. Soft violin melody returns. In truth, Marx was never a prophet. He never claimed to see the future, only the cracks in his own world. He lived in poverty, often unable to feed his children. He wrote not for glory, but out of desperation, a belief that the world could be kinder. When he died in 1883, only 11 people attended his funeral. His last words, recorded by his housekeeper, were almost humorous. Go on, get out. Last words are for fools who haven't said enough. And yet, a century later, his words would echo in every protest, every book, every argument about fairness. The resurrection. Ambient strings swell. Slow camera pan through libraries, protests, classrooms, digital screens. So here we are, in a world more connected, more advanced, and yet more unequal than Marx could have ever imagined. His dream lives on, not in governments or manifestos, but in conversations, in the worker demanding fair pay, in the student asking why the rich get richer, in the activist standing before the police line, chanting for justice. They may not call it Marxism, but in spirit, it's the same fight, because Marx's true power was never his revolution. It was his question. How long will we allow the few to rule the many? Every age buries its prophets in silence, but somehow their voices find a way back. Karl Marx has been dead for nearly a century and a half, and yet his name still lingers. In classrooms, in protests, in the whisper of history itself. He is remembered as many things. A philosopher, a rebel, a destroyer, and a dreamer. But what did he truly leave behind? A world freed from oppression? Or a warning we still haven't understood? The grave at Highgate. Sound, soft rain, distant thunder, footsteps on gravel. If you walk through Highgate Cemetery in London, past the rows of moss-covered stones, you will find a monument rising among the trees. A bronze bust carved with a single phrase beneath it. Workers of all lands unite. It marks the resting place of Karl Marx. Tourists and students come from around the world. Some to pay respect. Others to argue. Some just to stare. The man who changed the world with his pen lies beneath the damp English soil. A refugee. A father who buried his children in poverty, a thinker who died without glory. When his funeral was held on March 17, 1883, only 11 people came. No banners, no crowds, no revolution. And yet, within a few decades, his ideas would ignite empires, topple monarchies, and shape the destiny of billions. Ideas that refuse to die. Soft piano begins, melancholic but hopeful. History has tried again and again to bury Marx, with ridicule, with censorship, with blood. But the truth is, You cannot bury a question. And Marx did not give the world an answer. He gave it a question so powerful, so human, that it never stopped haunting us. Who truly owns the world we live in? That question survived the fall of Berlin, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the silence that followed. It traveled through libraries, into classrooms, onto protest banners, and into the language of art, film, and literature. Even those who reject Marx still speak the language he gave them. Class, labor, capital, exploitation, revolution. He didn't just write a book. He rewrote the vocabulary of injustice, the dream and the dilemma. Tone shifts, deeper, more philosophical. Marx's greatest dream was not a government or a flag. It was a world where no man would need to enslave another, just to survive. A world where work would give meaning, not misery. Where ownership would be shared, and dignity would not depend on wealth. But the tragedy of history is that noble ideas rarely survive contact with power. From Lenin's Russia to Mao's China, his dream was turned into doctrine, and doctrine into domination. Factories of hope became prisons of ideology. The working man became the servant of the party. And in the name of freedom, millions lost their own. Marx never lived to see any of it. He could not have imagined the totalitarian shadows that would march under his name. And yet, those who came after forgot something vital. Marx believed in liberation, not control, in understanding, not obedience. He gave the world a torch, but the world used it as a weapon. The ghost in the machine. Sound, faint hum of modern life, cars, computers, voices blending. Today in our digital age, we live inside systems far more complex than anything Marx could have conceived. Algorithms decide our jobs, our news, our futures. The factory has no walls. The worker has no chains. Only deadlines, metrics, and silent exhaustion. And yet the pattern remains. The few still rule the many. Wealth still rises faster than fairness. And people still ask, why? Every economic crash, every protest, every voice that dares to speak against the structure is, in its own way, a conversation with Marx's ghost. He is not gone. He has simply changed form. He is there, in the whisper of rebellion that never dies. The man behind the myth. Soft violin melody, intimate tone. To understand Marx, you must first strip away the myth. He was not a monster. He was not a god. He was a man, flawed, stubborn, brilliant, haunted by compassion. He loved Shakespeare, wrote poetry to his wife, and spent most of his life fighting hunger, debt, and illness. He failed, often. He doubted himself. He made enemies even among his friends. But through all of it, he kept writing, because he could not bear the thought of a world where suffering was considered normal. His revolution was not born from hatred. It was born from empathy. The question that remains. Music deepens, slow, haunting strings. So now, in the 21st century, as the world faces automation, inequality, and ecological collapse, Marx's question stands once more before us, unchanged, unbroken. How long will profit matter more than people? It is not a question of politics anymore. It is a question of survival. Will we allow history to repeat its cruelty? Or will we finally learn from the ghosts that came before us? Because every empire, no matter how powerful, eventually collapses, and every idea, no matter how buried, eventually returns. The final reflection. Crescendo builds, emotional orchestral music. Karl Marx dreamed of a world where humanity, not money, was the measure of worth. He believed that the future could be written by those who dared to imagine it differently. And though history twisted his dream, the heart of his message still beats. Beneath the noise of our modern world, that freedom is not just the right to speak. It is the right to live without fear, without hunger, without humiliation. Perhaps that is what Marx truly left behind. Not a system, but a conscience. A reminder that no matter how far we progress, we must never forget the people who build the foundation beneath our dreams.